very much. A number of those agencies that you've just listed there, gentlemen, do not have provision for third country participation. Some have provision, for example, for international organisations to be on there, but clearly the United Kingdom would not be in that category. Some that really stand out in this context are the European Medicines Agency, EASA, European Environment Agency, etc. This is to all three of you gentlemen, so please feel free to answer. What would you say would be the right approach to trying to find the way towards a strategic partnership? How long do you think that would take? Is there any precedent for these agencies creating the basis for third country participation when they don't have that anywhere in their founding statutes?
Dr. Stephen, yes, please.
So thank you very much for the question. The three standardisation organisations in Europe are used by the European Union, but they are not European Union agencies. They have a membership of 34 countries, so including countries outside the EU, EFTA countries and accession countries. There is no provision in their statutes at present for a country with a political relationship that the UK will have with the EU post-Brexit to remain a membership. So our strategy based on our stakeholder engagement is to seek a change in those statutes to continue to fill that vacuum, if you like, that a country that is fulfilling the rules of CEN and CENELEC continues its full membership. These bodies, because the critical point here is that standards are not regulation. These are private organisations used by the European Commission, but they are comprised of one member per country, and it's in their hands that membership can continue. So the confusion between standards and regulations is widely seen in the media today, and it's a very awkward problem because we're bundling up two things, one which is voluntary industry, market-led, pro-competitive activity, and it's confused with regulatory activity. So from the perspective of the standardisation organisations, CEN and CENELEC, we have a plan to seek to continue, on behalf of our stakeholders, UK membership of those organisations.
Thank you.
Professor Turk?
I think it depends on which model of general participation envisage or engagement with the European Union. If you take the EEA, EFTA states, they have a very comprehensive relationship and they participate in the internal market, and that also bilaterally gives them access through the annexes and protocols of the agreement in over 30 agencies. You will see Norway being basically member in many of those agencies, or at least observers, but all have no voting rights. So they sit around a table, but with no voting rights. If you look at Switzerland, Switzerland has access to agencies via bilateral agreements, and Switzerland sits in about 4 or 5 of those agencies, precisely the ones that I've mentioned. And then you have sort of bilateral agreements. Take EASA. EASA has a provision, Article 66 of its basic regulation, which allows third countries to participate. And Canada has a bilateral arrangement. But again, as far as I'm aware, it does not sit as an observer. So these arrangements are like bilateral recognition or almost like reciprocal arrangements for the aviation sector. Beyond that, as you rightly say, there aren't really any arrangements whereby other countries participate in the work of the agencies. That would have to be a bespoke arrangement or a bilateral agreement, and that can take time. So I think it's a time factor you're looking at. You're looking at years, I would have thought, of negotiating those bilateral arrangements.
Thank you.
And if I just focus a little bit maybe on one agency and talk through some of the issues that we think are relevant to that. So if we think of REACH, so the chemicals regulation, which applies across the European Union, which is about registration and evaluation of chemicals before they're placed on the market in the EU, regardless of whether they're manufactured in the EU or imported into the EU. The question is there, what kind of relationship should we be after with ECHA, so the European Chemicals Regulatory Agency? So in REACH, Assuming that the UK is coming out of the single market, then the Swiss type of model might be one that is relevant. So Switzerland is in EFTA but outside the EEA. Switzerland does not have REACH. So if the UK chose not to have REACH, so not to be party to the European chemicals regulatory regime after exit, then what would need to happen is we may not need to have a close relationship with ECHA. We could have our own system of chemicals regulation, but businesses that wanted to import into the European Union would need to have some kind of presence within the European Union. Generally, for third countries at the moment, that's done by the way of an ordinary, an only representative, rather, so it's an OR effectively. So you set up something inside the EU. So that's one way of fixing it and ensuring that chemicals can travel across borders. Another way would be to have a closer relationship, let's say, with the internal market, a Norway type arrangement. And Norway, we were just discussing out there, Norway has a number of close relationships with actually a wide range of EU regulatory bodies because it's part of the EEA. So really it takes quite a full role in these bodies, regardless of whether it's observer status, and pays for that privilege or obligation, whichever way you want to look at it. So I think there are a number of different models, and it's down to us to choose effectively.
Thank you. Just looking at the next phase of the negotiations, which is going to focus on the transition period, the European Union's made it very clear that the transition period will, in effect, be a carbon copy of the status quo. So they've said it will be, they'll have the same jurisdiction, budgetary, enforcement, supervisory mechanisms. Is it your understanding then that, assuming that that will be what's agreed between the EU and the UK, that our current participation in the agencies would not change during a transition period?
Shall I start?
Please.
I think as a matter of law, that's what the EU will require, ask for. I think as a matter of fact, it might be something quite different, because we've already seen since the Brexit vote that the UK secondees, let's say, in the UK's influence within certain institutions, as a matter of fact, is lesser. So decision making within the European Commission, for example, less account is given to UK voices within decision making within the European Commission in competition law, for example. So we've seen very clearly that has diminished. So I think we need to think about the legal position, which is the EU will ask for full and ongoing submission, engagement to the EU agencies. As a matter of fact, what we need to be thinking about is where do we want to end up, and be thinking about and cognizant of the fact that our actual influence within these agencies might go through a dip. And in fact, after Brexit, it might be greater or it might be lesser. We just don't know.
We have, from the international standards perspective, the system is entirely integrated. So we are, as the UK, a leader in the international standards development organisations and in the European organisations. And as I say, these are not EU agencies. So in an integrated system, the United Kingdom economy depends on a catalogue of industry standards which have come 95% now every year on year, are international and European, and these are complementary, not a binary choice. The European standards that we work on with our 11,500 experts, UK experts from all walks of life, contribute to areas of the economy where international standards aren't working. So it's not a binary choice. It's international, and then the European system of 34 countries is perhaps the most developed aspect of the international journey that our countries are on. That journey is on towards one standard used everywhere. This is what's happening with China and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and of course in the European countries we've been doing that for some time. So this influence is really absolutely critical. And to your question, the risk is that with a vacuum in the statutes of these organisations around membership, the risk is that there's a loss of confidence and the UK is either challenged or that our experts who are volunteers lose confidence in the system. And by stepping away from that integrated system, we suddenly become a follower. We are marginalised in the international standards system where we are today a leader. So there's a very high risk that even in a transition period, there could be challenge as to why UK experts were leading all of these industry market committees, and why were they still there when the statutes say there isn't a place for you. So we need to work swiftly, and the messages that we've been receiving in the last few weeks are encouraging in terms of being able to convey that to the fellow members of the European organisations, to the boards of those organisations. But it is possible that UK government could act in a way that would prejudice that activity. And so certainty around that is really fundamental, that the system of the use of voluntary standards with regulation in a performance-based structure with a single standard would continue. That's where we're going to continue. And if that's the way we do that, we should get past that point.
I think one needs to distinguish between institutions, agencies and comitology committees. In the institutions, in the transition, my understanding is the UK will no longer be present. In the agencies, there's now basically different reports. One here is in the initial guidelines, my understanding was the UK will still participate in the agencies, will have no voting rights. Though yesterday I read in the Financial Times that they have changed the guidelines, and it will now be foreseen that in the guidelines, that's not the negotiated position, but in the EU guidelines, that the UK will be neither participating, will not be participating in the agencies at all. The third part, so that will basically mean that in the transition, will the UK be at least there around the table as a participating member or as an observer without any voting rights, or not be there at all? If not be there at all, that would be highly detrimental, I would have thought. The last part is comitology committees. I don't know which roles they play, and you understand what role they play, but when the Commission makes implementing decisions, implementing legislation, for example, approving medicinal products, there is a committee of member states which controls and examines the Commission's draft decisions. Now, if the UK is not part of that, it will not understand what is going on while still having to accept the laws. So there is a model whereby the EFTA states are participating but not voting. At the very least, during the transition, I would probably say the UK ought to be participating, even if it is not voting.
Okay.